Hi everyone, my name is Min-Kyu, and today I'm going to be talking about externalities for environmental economics. So let's get started. What are we going to talk about today? First, we're going to talk about what externalities are. Then we're going to talk about why externalities are a problem, and really some of the solutions to externalities right after. And then finally, we're going to summarize everything that we talked about in our few minutes together. So let's get started. What are externalities? Well, according to Merriam-Webster dictionary, an externality is the quality or state of being external or externalized. Not a very useful definition. Let's try another one. So according to Harvard, externalities arise whenever the actions of one economic agent directly affects another economic agent outside the market mechanisms. That's a much better definition, but of course, like with all things in economics, it's a lot easier to understand this with an example. So let's look at a kind of a simplified world where we only have two entities. We have factories and we have fishermen. And let's assume that at first, these two produce no externalities. They are both producing such that we have an optimal outcome. And so in this case, we see that the factory's private benefit would be 15, the fisherman's private benefit would be 10, and this overall brings a total social benefit of 35. Now, let's kind of take away that optimism and that assumption that we had at first, and let's see what happens when the factory produces more and starts to produce a lot more garbage and essentially ends up making an externality. Now we see that the factory's private benefit goes up to 20. So it went from 15 to 20. So obviously factories will choose to do this. But we see that because of this extra production, the factory's producing garbage. And that garbage, let's say, is killing the fish. And so fishermen are getting zero private benefit now. And so overall, what we see is that the total social benefit goes down from 35 that it was before to 20 because fishermen aren't getting any benefit anymore. And so that's what we're really talking about when we're talking about externalities. We're talking about that factory making that economic decision in its market mechanisms to increase production, to make garbage, but the factory doesn't care. But this is overall making a worse world with less social benefit because of the garbage produced. Now, let's take a step back and talk about externalities at kind of a bigger picture. So externalities can first be split into two kind of categories, both positive and negative externalities. Because we're talking about environmental economics, we're going to talk a lot more about negative externalities because a lot of the things in economics, like pollution and garbage and all that, are really negative externalities. Now let's look at the other side and let's see what category externalities are a part of. Externalities are what we call a market failure. And so that also includes things like monopolies and some of the outcomes that public goods might bring. Now, obviously, market failure sounds like a bad thing, and it is a bad thing. But let's talk really more about what market failures are and why they might be a problem. And so market failures, according to Harvard again, are defined as a problem that violates one of the assumptions of the first welfare theorem and causes the market economy to deliver an outcome that does not maximize efficiency. And so while those a lot of words again, and that's actually a very good definition. Very simply put, what we're talking about is when the market is failing to give an optimal result. And that's what a market failure is. And so now let's go back to externalities and see what happens. So this is kind of what happens in that kind of idealistic world we talked about at first, where the private and social costs are the same and the private and social benefit are the same. At this point, we're making this kind of perfect point at Q star, P star, and we're producing at the optimal point, right? And so overall, we see that the benefit, the total benefit that we're making in this market is optimal, and it's that green triangle right there. Now, really the total benefit, as we all know, is that area below the blue line, which is the benefit line, and above the cost line. And of course, behind like the amount that's produced. Now, let's add an externality in here. Let's add garbage in and see what happens. And so we saw that the social costs and the private costs kind of got split. And that's because the factory is actually producing that social cost, but it's not considering the garbage. And so from its perspective, the private cost is lower. And so then the factory is going to start producing at P1, Q1, and that means that we're overproducing. And so we have a deadweight loss shown in that red triangle. And so overall, what we see is that the externality is causing deadweight loss through overproduction. Now let's look at a possible solution that we could have to this problem. So reviewing our problem, we see that the issue is that market mechanisms really are only around the factory, and it's not capturing enough of this kind of chain of factory garbage fishermen for factories to care about the garbage that it produces. So one solution to this is taxes. So taxes kind of let us take that garbage and then kind of quote unquote loop it back around into factories so that the market mechanisms that the factory cares about include the garbage that it produces, includes that externality. And so quickly, let's review what a tax is. According to Merriam-Webster, it's a charge, usually of money, imposed by an authority, in this case, usually the government, on persons or property for public purposes. The public purpose in this case probably is that the government wants to kind of get rid of the externality, or not get rid of it, but to bring it into market mechanisms so that we are producing at an optimal amount. And so let's go back to our graph example and see what happens with taxes. So this is kind of where we were before. Now, when we add taxes to it, now the market mechanisms are taking care of the garbage, right? Or bringing that garbage, kind of the cost of that garbage back to the factory. What we see is that the private cost equals the social cost again if there's an ideal amount of tax. And so we see that the cost is kind of brought right back up to where it should be at the social cost. And so now we're producing again at the optimal point of Q star P star without any deadweight loss. And so overall, we can see that the ideal amount of taxes can eliminate deadweight loss when they're kind of applied properly. Now let's go back to our original kind of scenario of having separate social and private costs. And let's see what maybe a problem could be with these taxes, right? It sounds like a perfect solution. What's really the problem? So obviously, policymakers don't have access to these graphs and don't have all these perfect numbers, right? And so they're really they're really guessing when they're making these decisions. They have some data, but obviously that's not going to always be sufficient. And so if we add a tax, but the tax is too great, this is what happens. That private cost goes way too high. And essentially what we see is now we're producing at Q2 instead of Q star. And we're producing way too little. Now we're underproducing, so we're taxing too much. That means that the damages that the factory is causing by garbage, they're really overpaying for it, right? They're paying way too much, and now the price is way too high. Now, what does that mean? That means, of course, again, deadweight loss. In this case, shown in this kind of red area here. And so what we can really conclude overall from this is that in the same way that no taxes cause deadweight loss when there's an externality, too much taxes can also cause deadweight loss. And so let's quickly summarize everything we talked about today. First, we talked about externalities. And so what are externalities? Externalities are when one entity's actions are kind of affecting another's outside market mechanisms. And so we saw that example of garbage from factories, and the garbage is outside the market mechanism for the factory, and it's killing fish and it's decreasing the overall kind of social utility. But it makes sense from like the factory's private perspective, right? Then we talked about why externalities are a problem, really because of market failure. We're not producing the optimal result. There's inefficiency. And really, this externality is causing these private entities to produce at non-optimal outputs because that's what they're incentivized to do by the market. And then finally, we saw a solution to this, which is using taxes, which uses the government to include those kind of additional costs from negative externalities to the private costs. And then we finally, at the end, kind of quickly talked about why it's really hard to get those right taxes. And if we don't get that correct amount of taxation, what can kind of happen? Really, namely, more deadweight loss. And so overall, we see that externalities are kind of one of the key concepts in economics and are really important and have all of these factors kind of play into it. And so finally, these are kind of the citations that we used throughout the presentation. And overall, I hope you learned something about externalities, especially in an environmental economic context. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.